Good morning, everyone. A reminder that we are sitting in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. It is my pleasure to introduce you today to Musqueam elder Larry Grant. Elder Grant was born and raised in Musqueam traditional territory by a traditional Hankaminam speaking Musqueam family. He is the elder in residence at UBC's First Nation House of Learning. In 2014, Larry became an honorary graduate from the Indigenous Teacher Education Program at UBC, and he is currently assisting in revitalizing Hankaminam in the Musqueam Language and Cultural Department and co-teaching the introductory language course through UBC. In 2018, Elder Grant worked with SPPGA to bestow a new name upon the very room we're gathering in as Place of Many Trees, or Hohosesi Ketam. Sorry for the mispronunciation, if anything. Thank you for your ongoing engagement with the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, Elder Grant, and welcome. And thank you for introducing and welcoming also Mr. Ruiz Felipe Duchicela.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here this morning at the Liu Center for Global Policy for Global Issues. CEM to CIET, Ayaslak, Guanasquich, y tenets Musqueam. Lock sesiones, pues hilux toch de quinas, net omo, pues we to tomo Musqueam. Se conesiones, que plano y ultimoto, set something neat as follow, y hilux dollar, to mukalap, pues we to now wheel. When I tennis qualawan, quincy, quasnala, to non-amat the books them all because society squalawans homocos mustayo mak tamo I tap casium some. Want to say thank you to everyone that's logged on and for everyone that's here present at Secret at the Liu Institute at UBC on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Hankaminam speaking Musqueam people. As our ancestor had done in the past and welcomed all of the new peoples, the newcomers that had come on board the ship with Captain Narvaez, the Spaniard, and Captain George Vancouver, the Englishman, I raise my hands in thanks to and welcome to all of you here present today to discuss the policy of vision for self-determination of Indigenous peoples around the world. It's really been something to be able to name the room with the secret, the place where there are many trees. It's quite close to where our ancestor Cleoplano had a fortified site. And knowing that the room, when you look out the wall of windows, you can see a forest, and that is very representative of how it was prior to colonization. And that was the reason we called it the Schwarzasikat. And also that this policy for self-determination for Indigenous peoples around the world, many of us have been striving for that here, for self-determination. And some of this comes very closely here to UBC campus at Point Grey, in the sense that the awareness of our people is becoming more and more clear to the faculty, staff, and students of the community of University of British Columbia, Vancouver campus. And that's a part of our self-determination to be recognized as the people of this land, the original people of this land that were here for millennia prior to colonization. And it's our contribution as Musqueam people to bring awareness to UBC faculty, staff, and students on this campus, as we have named many streets, plant names and building names today that was not done properly prior to a few years ago. And it's really a pleasure to be able to see and gratifying to see our presence on campus being noticed and seen and being a part of the academic community. So Colette Quincy Tiatola, Taswalap of Namat, Ku'i Tanawel, Hajep Kasiam Nasea. Thank you very much. Hajka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elder Grant, for your welcoming words. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ruiz Felipe Duchicela, an indigenous leader from Ecuador, from the Puruá region of Chimborazo. He became the first Minister of Indigenous Peoples Affairs in Latin America in 1992, and went on to become the first senior advisor for indigenous peoples at the World Bank. After retiring from that institution in 2018, he became the senior advisor for indigenous peoples issues at USAID. In that capacity, he wrote, consulted, and approved the 2020 U.S. Agency for International Development Policy for Indigenous Peoples. Since the policy was enacted, Mr. Duchicela has worked for the past years not only to devolve indigenous rights to its traditional lands and territories, but also help them build their own economic opportunities and find investment partnerships in the process. Mr. Duchicela holds a master in public and private management from Yale University, and a message for my students emphasizing in finance, strategy, and quantitative analysis. Also, he holds a BA in social planning and architecture from Universidad Central in Ecuador. He's about to publish a book of selected essays on key issues about indigenous peoples and development. The title of this talk is A Policy with a Vision for Self-Determined Development for Indigenous Peoples Globally. Thank you for coming, Luis Felipe, and welcoming reception to you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Grace. And it's a privilege to be here. And Elder Larry Grant, it's a pleasure to meet you. And thank you very much for your words that really inspire us. And it's a privilege really to be with you and also to be in the land of your people, and particularly in this room, as you mentioned, that it's the place with many trees. So thank you for giving us these words of inspiration and strength. So I'm going to be speaking about the policy of USAID on promoting the rights of indigenous peoples. And I would like to just make a very small clarification based on Grace's words. Actually, I did not write the policy. Colleagues at USAID prior to me drafted most of the policy. I was consulted while I was at the World Bank and helped USAID colleagues to draft it, but it was much their work. When I came to USAID, I did make some adjustments, but I think my main contribution was to ensure that it was approved. I carried out and led the process for the final approval of the policy, which took us about 8 months since I started at USAID from June 2019 to March 2020. Later in my presentation, I'm going to invite my colleague Rita Spadafora, who is here also to present on the Indigenous Peoples Alliance for Rights and Development, which is a partnership project co-funded by USAID, but I will introduce her properly later on. Let me share my screen now so that we can use some slides. And I understand we're going to have a period of questions and answers towards the end, so you're welcome to write your questions or to have your questions ready. Just checking, is my screen being shown?
Yeah,
Grace?
everything looks good. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first of all, I would like to remind everybody that the two main international instruments that we have regarding the rights of indigenous peoples in the world are the first is the Convention 169 from the International Labor Organization from 1989, ILO 169, as it is called, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention. This is a very, very important document that I think many of you know. It set the groundwork for the protection of rights of indigenous peoples in the modern era. And then in September 2007, indigenous peoples, after more than 40 years of advocacy work and very, very intelligent and forceful negotiation at the highest level of the UN, the General Assembly of the UN finally approved the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is it's really a very solid document that that should be used by governments in order to advance the rights of indigenous peoples. At USAID, we're very happy, as I said before, that that our policy was approved in March 2020. Former Administrator Mark Green said these words at that time: working with indigenous peoples is a practical and a moral imperative in promoting peaceful, inclusive, and democratic societies in the countries in which we work. We have much to learn from them, the indigenous peoples. Please read the new policy and put it into practice in your work. So since then, we've been disseminating the policy, and as I'm going to show you in this presentation, we've been supporting its practical implementation. So the overarching goal of the policy is to improve the measurable impact and sustainability of USAID's programs by ensuring that our staff and implementing partners do these three things that we see here. First, to engage indigenous peoples as meaningful partners in development processes. Number two, to safeguard against harm. And finally, to enhance their ability to promote their rights, determine their own priorities, and advance their self-reliance. So you can see here that this is the reason why we chose the title of this presentation to be a policy to advance self-determined development for indigenous peoples globally. Because the policy, as you're going to see, I believe, and having been at the World Bank and in other institutions in my career, I really believe that this USAID policy sets a new paradigm in terms of advancing the rights of indigenous peoples and facilitate the steps in order for indigenous peoples to achieve self-determination. The policy has 4 key objectives, which are interconnected. The first objective is to strengthen engagement, to safeguard and align priorities. And it's very important to emphasize that engagement is in the context of this policy is something that must be taken very seriously. Engagement is a permanent process with indigenous peoples. It's has to be transparent. It needs to be oriented to develop trust. It should not be opportunistic, but rather it should be something that leads to a long-lasting partnership with indigenous peoples. The second objective is to integrate the priorities of the indigenous peoples into the portfolio of USAID missions and bureaus around the world. And to do this using a cross-sectoral approach to programming. What does this mean? This means that here we're recognizing that indigenous peoples have a holistic view or a holistic vision for their own lives and their own future. And that our programs need to also be holistic, need to be cross-sectoral. So here we're encouraging the USAID missions to avoid excessively sectoral projects, or if they're going to implement sectoral projects such as health, education, agriculture, etc., to bear in mind that indigenous peoples need to have a holistic view for their future. The third objective is to empower the indigenous peoples' representative organizations and build their capacity. And the fourth objective is to foster an enabling environment to exercise their rights. This has to do mainly with the political environment in a given country. It has to do with public policy. It has to do with constitutional rights. It has to do with legislation in a given country to recognize the rights of the indigenous peoples. So as you can see, these 4 objectives work together and they cannot be separated. They are interconnected, and in order to have impact at the end, they need to be implemented. All of them need to be implemented. Then we have 5 operating principles. So this principles is what guides a practitioner at USAID in order to implement the policy so that it adheres to the program cycle, as we call it in USAID. So there are 5 operating principles. First is to identify indigenous peoples. And this is very important, especially in some countries, some contexts, some regions where there may be some controversy about who belongs to an indigenous people's community or not. The second principle is to analyze. It means to carry out the proper assessments and studies. We're going to see each one of these in more detail. Then to engage with indigenous peoples, as we had said before. The fourth principle is to safeguard against harm, and the final principle is to partner with indigenous people. So let's review very quickly each one of these. So the identification of indigenous peoples, USAID uses these 7 criteria to identify indigenous peoples. So as many of you know, what United Nations says is that we cannot define indigenous people. There is no universal definition because there's more than 5,000 nations around the world, each one with its own culture, name, language, etc. So what we can do at the country level is to identify indigenous people. So these criteria that you see here: self-identification as a distinct social and cultural group, recognition of this identity by others, historical continuity with pre-colonial or pre-settler societies, collective attachment to territories and surrounding natural resources, customary social, economic, or governance institutions that are distinct from the dominant society, a distinct language or dialect, and or a resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. It's important to note that, for instance, the World Bank only has 4 of these criteria, but USAID decided to enhance this to make it more robust and added these other, so it's a total of 7 criteria. The second principle is to analyze indigenous people's issues. So the policy recommends that together with indigenous people's organizations, their networks, their communities, USAID carry out substantive work to understand the circumstances of indigenous peoples. For instance, we see some of the items that need to be studied: the laws, the policies, the regulations, cultural norms, roles and responsibilities, patterns of power and decision-making, access to and control over assets and resources, personal safety and security, and many others. So the idea is to together with indigenous peoples, prior to designing a program or a project, to make sure that the situation, circumstances, needs, and aspirations of the indigenous peoples are very well understood and documented. It is recommended to use this inclusive development analysis and also political economy analysis. The third principle is to engage with indigenous peoples. And for that, there is a tool in our website. It's a consultation handbook with essential elements of consultations. And the idea with this consultation handbook, it starts with the identification of indigenous peoples, communication with stakeholders early and often, good faith consultation through representative institutions, enable engagement with decision-making mechanisms, and influence the planning and development process. Now, one important thing to keep in mind here is that the process of engaging with indigenous peoples may take many shapes or forms. And one of the things that we're encouraging is for practitioners in the field to be innovative, to be creative, to discuss this with indigenous peoples, so that the engagement process is robust, is rich, and it leads to an excellent and long-term partnership. The fourth principle is to safeguard indigenous peoples' rights and protect against harm. Here we have a tool which is a social impact assessment. And basically, the idea is to assess the risks, the social risks for indigenous peoples, and to determine whether that risk is the level of risk, if it's moderate, if it's high, and based on that, then establish mitigation measures or do further analysis. The fifth principle is to partner with indigenous peoples. And for this, what we're encouraging is the process of co-creation, the tool of co-creation, which is a design approach that brings people together to collectively produce a mutually valued outcome using a participatory process that assumes some degree of shared power decision-making. I'm going to show you in a little while an example of how USAID has begun to use this tool of co-creation. And I really believe in this, and I think this participatory planning and design is critical for the success of any project. There's one clear policy mandate, which is mandatory, is that there must be a statement of impact. So missions that implement projects for indigenous peoples need to have a documented written statement of impact. If there is potential adverse impact, then through consultation, the mission needs to co-create mitigation measures. But if the impact may be significant, then the policy encourages to pursue free, prior, and informed consent. So here's a summary of the 4 tools for the program cycle that we have seen before. Again, these are available in our website, but again, we encourage the missions and anybody really, all practitioners, to be creative and to add more tools to this toolkit as they implement the policy. Okay, so this is the summary. Up to this point is a summary of the policy. Now I would like to present to you an example. This is one example of which we feel very proud, and this is a project in Mesoamerica. It's called BATS, which is a Mayan word that means strength, and it's a regional and local institutional strengthening project. The partners here were USAID, the Rainforest Foundation US, and the Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques, or the Mesoamerican Alliance of Peoples and Forests, which is an organization that covers from Mexico to Panama. Roughly 24 million indigenous peoples live in these countries. As many of you know, this is a region that has deep challenges that persist over time, causing migration from their communities. And the Alianza Mesoamericana emerged more than a decade ago as an organizational response to this crisis. It has a broad platform for political advocacy aimed at national governments and donors, regional coordination, and is improving the capacity of its member organizations. So what we did here is to co-create a project that included leaders, staff, women, and youth from 6 countries. USAID's funding was of $2 million over 3 years for project operations in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. The Rainforest Foundation US has partnered with indigenous peoples over 30 years, but it's a new USAID partner, and the Rainforest Foundation acts as a fiduciary partner in this case. In other words, the model is a coalition between Rainforest Foundation US and the Mesoamerican Alliance, where the Rainforest Foundation US is the fiduciary agent, but the organization that leads the program, that actually implements the program, is the Mesoamerican Alliance. All project staff are integrated into regional, national, or local organizations. ANPB and its decentralized entities will no longer need the financial intermediation of NGOs to access funding from the US government and others. So that's the longer term goal, right? That through this process, it's a temporary process, or a process that will allow the Mesoamerican Alliance to gain the strength, the expertise, the capacity to absorb resources, to manage their own programs, and to manage their own the funding that they receive from outside donors. One important thing is the question that you may be asking yourself: well, what is the $2 million going to be invested in? You know, what is it going to strengthen? So here, one important feature of this model is that USAID is basically supporting exactly the same aspirations or the same vision that the Indigenous organization has already defined as their vision for the future. So it's not imposing something different, but rather is financing what they had already envisioned in this case, in the 6 countries that the Alianza Mesoamericana operates. So some of the key institutional entities that the project will strengthen are the following: a Mesoamerican School of Leadership that they have already created, that is a itinerant school without walls for strengthening the capacities of indigenous peoples and local community youth and local leadership, that incorporates new topics such as education for community action, how to organize and prepare communities for disasters in the context of climate change and emergencies, and educational activities will be complemented by staff and resources for advocacy and communications, enabling communities to put learning into practice. There's also a coordination of territorial women leaders of Mesoamerica, made up of representative women leaders of organizations and communities. So the project will support the design of an organizational strengthening plan that will feed more holistic ways of incorporating the women's agenda into the AMPB strategic plan and advocacy activities. The project is already helping to identify and socialize needs, gaps, and strategies to better promote the political participation of women and respond to their needs. And this one is a very new idea that the Mesoamerican Alliance has, which is to create a Mesoamerican Territorial Fund. So it's a mechanism to attract and channel climate and development financing to the indigenous and community territories of the region. So the AMPB over 10 years has already channeled close to $9 million to IPLC territories through small grants, etc. So they want to strengthen this and improve their management of this Mesoamerican Territorial Fund. And finally, their technical secretariat, which currently is located in Nicaragua. So the project will support the legal constitution of AMPB to manage their own financial resources, drafting of a new strategic plan, design of new monitoring, evaluation, and learning, collaboration, and adaptation system, and design and launch of new evidence-based regional advocacy initiatives. So here are some reflections and recommendations that came out of the process of co-creation that lasted about a year, in which we all learned the mission of Guatemala, the USAID mission of Guatemala must be commended, and particularly my colleague Ahmed Jimenez, who is an advisor in the Guatemala USAID mission, for having led this process, which was mostly a capacity building process, a learning process, reaching agreements and learning and teaching both Rainforest Foundation US and the AMPB how to produce all the documents, the requirements that USAID needs to have in order to give a grant to a particular organization. As you know, USAID's money is taxpayer money from the US, and there's a lot of scrutiny. There's a lot of controls over how that money is used. So the grantees need to have established systems of accounting, financial management, financial controls, monitoring and evaluation, etc. So all those things were covered during the process of co-creation. So this, in a snapshot, is the project, but we have other projects. We have another project similar to this in Southern Africa with the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee and an NGO called Natural Justice from Cape Town. There's another project being co-created right now in Ecuador, which is my home country, with the Fundación Raíz and the Confeniae and the Chachi Federation of Ecuador. It's being co-created right now between USAID and the indigenous peoples and the Fundación Raíz. So this is a model we're using in order to walk the talk, as they say, to really co-create with indigenous peoples in a way that they become more empowered to actually manage the projects. Now, I would like to make a quick presentation on something that it's very important for USAID, and I think it's going to be helpful beyond USAID. It's the Indigenous Peoples Alliance for Rights and Development. So this is a project that is co-funded by USAID through a mechanism called the Global Development Alliance, in which USAID partners with someone in the private sector. In this case, we partner with the Forest Stewardship Council, who had in turn created or helped create the FSC Indigenous Foundation. And the IPART project then became a reality, and it's a new global capacity development initiative to create long-term solutions with and for Indigenous peoples. So it's a partnership between USAID and the Forest Stewardship Council to empower Indigenous peoples globally to defend their rights and advance towards self-determined development. It's implemented by the FSC Indigenous Foundation, which is led and managed by Indigenous peoples worldwide. Initially, the project was established with a $13 million grant over a 5-year program, and it started to focus in Guatemala and Panama. It was later increased. The funding was increased by $8 million for a complementary project called the Indigenous Women Economic Empowerment Strategy, focusing on 3 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So now I would like to introduce my colleague, Rita Spadafora. Rita is the lead of the capacity development and inclusion component or pillar of the IPART. She's based, as this program is all of it is based in Panama City, Panama, and she will then help us understand the key objectives and the strategic approaches of IPART. Rita, please.
Thanks, Luis Felipe. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar and complement a bit more what Ruiz Felipe has shared about the FSC Indigenous Foundation and the IPART program. IPART has 3 interlinked objectives that are the pillars to test our theory of change. That basically states that if Indigenous peoples are provided with increased access to capacity development, spaces for inclusive decision-making, and support for Indigenous-led business enterprises, then Indigenous peoples will be better equipped to influence public-private decision-making and achieve other objectives such as self-governance and sustainable economies. So the first objective is to implement a capacity development program for Indigenous peoples organizations and key stakeholders such as government entities and the private sector. For this objective, we need to prepare tools such as an Indigenous organizational capacity assessment, a tool to assess the level of capacities of Indigenous peoples, and we also need to prepare a tool to assess the level of understanding of key stakeholders on Indigenous peoples' issues, to prepare capacity development plans for Indigenous peoples' organizations and stakeholders that have influence over them, with the intention to create a common basic understanding that promotes productive dialogues, to develop the organizational capacity of IPOs to participate in decision-making, as well as to develop their technical capacities for their economic development. This first objective is a cross-cutting objective because it supports objectives 2 and 3. The second objective of IPART is to foster an enabling environment for the effective participation of Indigenous peoples in joint decision-making. IPART works with governments and key stakeholders from multilaterals, UN agencies, the private sector, CSOs, to ensure that platforms for decision-making that affect indigenous peoples are open and promote the participation of indigenous peoples representatives, including indigenous youth and women. And these spaces should be used to create agendas that include indigenous peoples' needs and aspirations at the national level. And the third objective is to promote business opportunities and partnerships for indigenous peoples' sustainable development based on innovative and self-determined economic models. It includes two strategic activities to achieve this, what we call the Private Indigenous Business Services, or PIBS, and the Indigenous Economies Working Group. PIBS is a space oriented to provide strategic services to indigenous people's businesses through support, basically. The Indigenous Economies Working Group brings together experts, indigenous experts from the academia and other organizations, and aims to better understand indigenous economic models, the environment in which these models can be successfully established, and identify actions to disseminate, replicate, and strengthen them. Dr. Jaramillo is leading this working group, which has a very unique and ambitious task to achieve. Next slide, please. IPART brings indigenous models and approaches for the implementation of the program. IPART has three strategic approaches. The indigenous program management approach is at the global level, is guided by the governance structure of the FSC's Council and the FSC's Permanent Indigenous Peoples Committee that I mentioned before. At the regional and country levels, IPART will create indigenous advisory groups with relevant representatives of indigenous peoples organizations who will serve as a space for collective decision-making to guide the strategic vision and implementation of the program, to engage with many other sectors, including national governments. The next approach is the country-focused approach, which, depending on each country and its context, will involve multi-sector efforts and resources to optimize the likelihood of long-lasting impact and benefits, partnering with different actors. And the multi-sectoral approach. IPART is all about creating alliances. Therefore, it will integrate aspirations and needs in all sectors that are relevant to indigenous peoples, focusing on their natural resource management, their rights, their economies, their social well-being, and other priorities based on national and regional context. At the operational level, IPART is implementing the approaches through two programmatic models: the Indigenous People Sustainability and Self-Determined Approach, which is an operational and programmatic guiding tool driven by 5 objectives. First one, the capacity development of indigenous peoples organizations. Second, promoting indigenous peoples' rights based on national political context. 3, scaling up of indigenous resource management practices connected to climate and market-based solutions. 4, development of indigenous economic models. And 5 is identifying alternatives to support inclusive, holistic, and cultural development. And the last operational approach is IPART's partnership model. All our approaches and models are based on how strong our partnerships are. Strategic, technical, and implementing partners will be mapped based on their potential to contribute to each of the programmatic objectives, but always guided by indigenous people's vision as the center of our work. IPAR strategic partners, like I said, can be international organizations, UN agencies, multilateral development banks, bilateral agencies, business corporations, foundations, and local NGOs. All these models and approaches are interlinked and support our theory of change. Like I said, we're still building these tools and engaging partners, but we believe that the three pillars of IPAR together could or should make a contribution to change. Over to you, Luis Felipe.
Thank you very much, Rita. So let me give you an example of how IPART can provide high-level support in a given country. And actually, this is what IPART is doing right now in Guatemala and in Panama. But generally speaking, the idea is that IPART can expand its scope to many other countries and to hopefully replicate, and through partnership, as Rita was saying, to expand their support to other countries. So the idea is that IPART can bring technical and financial resources to help a USAID country mission in applying the pro-IP policy more effectively by strengthening the engagement process with Indigenous peoples' representative organizations. So we know that many times the engaging Indigenous peoples in a given country by the government of a country, or by the private sector of a government of a country, or by the civil society of a given country may be difficult, may be contentious, or may not exist. So here's where IPART can come in to facilitate that process, and through dialogues between Indigenous peoples' organizations, the national government, and the private sector. IPART can bring technical expertise, good practices, successful models, and experiences from anywhere in the world, so that a given country can nourish from those and can accelerate or can strengthen their process of engaging and coming up with agreements that allow for things to move forward. And also to strengthen the technical, managerial, and institutional capacities of Indigenous peoples' organizations themselves, so that they can lead and manage their own programs and projects. So it's all oriented to the empowering of the Indigenous peoples' organizations at the very end. For those of you who would be interested in learning more about USAID's policy, I would invite you to please check the website that we have at USAID/Indigenous Peoples. You're going to find there the complete text of the policy, implementation toolkits, blogs. We also have a set of regional and country profiles, a roadmap for engagement. There's a sectoral guidances. There's, I think, 5 or 6 sectoral guidances. Recently, there is a guidance for consultation and free prior informed consent. So I would welcome you to please look at our website. With this, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and thank you to Dr. Grace Jaramillo for having invited me. It's always a pleasure to speak at the University of British Columbia School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luis Felipe, for such a wonderful presentation about how to do. I mean, you did the practical step of explaining an actual process of enacting and implementing Indigenous policies at the multilateral level. Thank you very much for all that. We're now going into a process of Q&A. Please ask questions. This is a wonderful opportunity to learn more about the process, about the practices, about how to approach the relationship with the non-Indigenous peoples that want to be an ally or want to help in this process. Anybody?
There's some questions in the chat box.
Oh, yeah, we have many. Prana is going to help us navigate those ones. We can.
Sorry, to repeat the questions that are online, and the results coming right now. So Kritika asks, what is the sentiment at USAID regarding the recent apology by Pope Francis for the actions of some members of the Catholic Church in Canada's residential school system? Could you hear me?
Yes, yes, I heard. Well, I cannot speak on behalf of all of USAID, but I can certainly speak on behalf of myself and many others at USAID. And I think it's a well-received apology on the part of the Pope for those actions. So yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in the world, things like that are still happening in other parts of the world. It's something that we may not think it's happening, but it is happening in some parts of the world. So that's something that I'm very concerned about, and hopefully with policies such as this one at USAID, of course, this is only one effort, but hopefully other international development agencies and governments will emulate or will follow similar approaches to prevent such problems. I mean, the problems of violence against indigenous peoples is also another huge problem that we're concerned about. And at USAID, there is efforts in that area as well, but this policy is mostly oriented to empower the indigenous people so that they can become stronger in their own territories, in their own lands, and they can negotiate better with governments and other entities, including private sector. So that's mostly the approach. The approach is more proactive rather than an approach of that other organizations have of perhaps more along the human rights advocacy and that sort of thing. Yep.
The next question is from Larissa, and she asks, you mentioned that a key policy objective for USAID is to incorporate the priorities of indigenous people in their programs. How do you deal with the idea that development might not be a priority for indigenous peoples? We have seen several cases where self-determination clashes with the idea of development and even sustainable development projects. For example, the World Bank has funded many clean energy projects connected to environmental conflicts, threatening indigenous territories and livelihoods. Does USAID consider the idea of supporting the rights to indigenous-led post-development approaches and alternatives for development that might go beyond market relationships?
Yeah, this is a very good question, insightful question. The approach that we take is that number one, we need to respect indigenous people's wishes and aspirations, and the whole policy is oriented to engage with indigenous peoples in a respectful way, such that USAID acts as a facilitator, as an enabler for whatever they would like to do, not to impose anything upon them. That's the main point that or one of the main aspects of this policy. Now, in regard to the concept of development, I can tell you that based on my own reflections and my own experience, what I have seen is that indigenous peoples mainly reject unsustainable development. They mainly reject development that violates their rights and development that is not consulted with them. It's not necessarily that indigenous peoples outright reject all sorts of development. I think that that's something that, in my view, is at least from my experience, I have seen that increasingly is not the case. Now, rejecting unsustainable development, rejecting development that is disrespectful for their rights is legitimate. But to facilitate their own vision for development is something that many indigenous peoples welcome. And my own view regarding this topic is that there isn't sufficient efforts in the world to actually conceptualize or help the indigenous peoples to better conceptualize their own models of development in today's world and for the future. How to connect our ancestral knowledge, our vision and traditions, how to protect our culture and our territories, yet at the same time thrive in the contemporary world. I think that there is a lot of need to work in that area, together to conceptualize it and to perhaps begin taking some steps in that direction. And that's why this Rita mentioned this international working group for indigenous economies. That's the idea of that international working group for indigenous economies, is to how to better conceptualize that, for the future. So it's not something that is at least from my point of view, it's not something that is done already or is a given, but rather something that is evolving, is evolution. And it has to be done in a very respectful way, and it has to be done in a way led by the indigenous peoples. And that's what this policy is all about.
Thank you. That was a great answer. The next question, and so from your response, is by Remy, who asks, what opportunities do you see for the International Sustainability Standards Board to acknowledge and/or include adverse impacts on indigenous peoples in their global reporting framework? What metrics would you suggest they include?
Well, I don't feel very qualified to answer this question, to be frank with you, in regard to the International Sustainability Standards Board. But what I can tell you is that based on my experience at the World Bank, especially, where adverse impacts and safeguards was a top priority in their indigenous peoples policy. What I can tell you is that institutions, including governments, NGOs, development organizations, need to be very, very careful about magnifying the safeguards component of a given policy or a given approach. What do I mean by that? When a policy is all about risk management, when the policy is all about do no harm, then it creates a perverse effect. I have seen this in practical terms. In other words, exaggerating the do no harm aspect stifles action. And I don't think indigenous peoples want that. I think it's important to include a do no harm consideration in every project, in every program. But just like this policy has, if you keep in mind, if you remember the 5 operating principles that we have, only one of them is regarding safeguards. The other 4 are partnering, engaging, identifying, analyzing. So, but if a policy is all about doing no harm, then we might as well stay still and just don't move anywhere. And I don't really believe that indigenous peoples in the world want that. I visited many, many countries and talked to many people, indigenous people from Vietnam to China, Russia, Cambodia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Botswana, Colombia, Peru, Paraguay. I haven't seen that indigenous peoples want to stay stagnant. They want to recuperate, to revitalize their cultures, to be respected, to strengthen their communities, to be recognized, have rights, collective rights over their land. But they want to look for the future as well. So I would be hesitant to recommend that adverse impacts be magnified as an exclusive thing. It could be part of a broader approach. Yes, absolutely.
Since we are in that question, Ruiz Felipe, I wonder if you can comment, especially for future policymakers like my students, how to better partner with indigenous peoples, be proactive, be an ally, and work together hand in hand with indigenous peoples. We have worked together like many years by now. We know each other. How do you recommend is this partnership working better? What do you recommend for future policymakers, young people that want to engage and collaborate and help build that vision and those type of projects for indigenous peoples that are non-indigenous like ourselves?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, I think the the attitude that we need to have, of course, is one of deep respect for the indigenous people's culture and their own traditions, but we need to also understand the rights of the indigenous peoples. And I think today we have excellent tools, because the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United Nations Declaration of Rights, gives us an excellent framework. And then we need to also consider many constitutional rights depending on the country where we are. So whoever wants to work with indigenous peoples need to do their homework. We need to educate ourselves. We need to understand those rights, and we need to understand the constitutional situation in a given country. And then we need to also understand the circumstances of indigenous people, their own culture. So that's one recommendation. The other recommendation that I give is that I think, as I said before, indigenous peoples, I don't think indigenous peoples, generally speaking, want to remain stagnant, want to remain static in history. I don't think so. I think they all want to move forward. They want to be part of the contemporary world, but they don't want to be disrespected. So what does that mean in practical terms? That means that they also need some tools. They also need some knowledge, some capacities to deal with the modern world. And a lot of times that capacity is lacking. So the question is, how can they attain that capacity, how they can acquire that capacity, but at the same time keep a strong connection to their community and their culture and their values. So that's the question. So for people who are not indigenous, like professionals that are studying, for instance, at the University of British Columbia, and want to dedicate their professional career or part of their professional career to working with indigenous peoples, my recommendation also is that indigenous peoples are going to expect that you bring something to them, that you contribute something. I really, to be frank with you, I don't like that classical, NGO-ish, I call it NGO-ish type of approach, in which we go to a community and we say, oh, we're coming to the community and we just come here to listen. You know, we take notes and listen, and we'll do whatever you want. I think that's a bit hypocritical, to be frank with you. You know, I mean, indigenous peoples are there, and if you go there and they know that you're a graduate of University of British Columbia, well, you better bring something good for us, you know, respectfully, of course, you know. So you have to also be educated in order to contribute, to provide something in a respectful way, you know, with a proper level of transparency and trust, so that they can accept whatever they think is good, you know, for them. But that vision that we just go there and take notes, I mean, you know, that is not real, and I think it's there's a lot of help that is needed right now in the indigenous communities. You know, indigenous peoples globally represent about 5% of the world population, but they represent about 15 to 17% of the extreme poor of the world. They're in places with tremendous, you know, marginalization problems, you know, violence and conflict and on all that. So there's a lot of help needed for indigenous people. So we cannot take a romantic view of work with indigenous peoples. We need to be pragmatic and be helpful in a real way. That's my advice.
My question is, yes, where does the government enter in this multilateral model of co-creation with the indigenous people in order to create long-lasting solutions? That's my question.
Did you hear that?
Can you repeat, please, the first part?
Raise your voice.
What is the role of the government in this model that you propose?
Yes, very important question. Very important question. In my view, and that's why the IPART project was created, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance for Rights and Development. If you recall what Rita presented, the second objective is the enabling environment. So we live in a world in which if a government does not recognize indigenous peoples, if a government does not recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, if a government does not have effective public policy to benefit indigenous peoples, then there is no grants, cooperation, money, prayers, anything that can help us. That is the truth of the matter. That is the reality of the matter. If a government is allowing rampant deforestation, intrusion in the forest and the territories of the indigenous peoples, is not respecting the right to language, is not respecting the right to intercultural education, then, you know, it's almost impossible for indigenous peoples to thrive and to advance. So in this particular policy, you remember the fourth objective of this policy is to foster an enabling environment. So what that means is that we need to use the convening power of USAID. We need to use the power that a bilateral agency has with funding, with technical assistance, so that governments can modify their behavior and governments can improve their public policy in favor of indigenous peoples. That's why the IPART project was created, because we realized that in order to get to that point, there needs to be dialogue and there needs to be education. I have talked to many government officials of many countries in the world that at the beginning, they seem opposed to the concept of working with indigenous peoples. But once you begin to educate them and say, well, why are you so opposed? I remember this government official in Kenya. I was in Kenya with a big meeting with indigenous peoples of Kenya, and he was in a government, in a ministry of Kenya, and they were mostly suspicious of this whole idea of recognizing the indigenous peoples. They're saying we're all Kenyans here, we're all indigenous. Why are you coming with this idea of some are indigenous, some are not indigenous, and you're dividing our country, you're fragmenting our country, you're creating division. We need unity. We're all Kenyans, we're all Tanzanians, we're all South Africans. That's happening in reality in a continent like Africa. But when you begin to unpack and say, have dialogues with them and say, look, indigenous peoples fought during 40 years, at least in modern era, for the recognition of rights of indigenous peoples at the United Nations. And it has been accepted that we indigenous peoples have collective rights over land, and that we have a special attachment to natural resources, to the wildlife and the forests and the oceans and the rivers. It has been recognized universally. And there's a reason for that. That is not going to debilitate your country. That's going to strengthen your country. To revitalize ancient cultures over, as the elder Larry Grant said, that has taken millennia to conserve and to develop. It's a treasure. It's a richness of your country. How can that be bad for your country? So once you start this process of dialogue and you begin to reason with government officials, at least you have some probability of success. Let's say that you still have a long ways to go, but at least you have. So that's my advice. That the dialogues will get you someplace. Now, again, there are some, I think one of the questions here that I saw talked about Brazil, for instance, and there's, of course, some situations in which the economic interests in a given region or geography makes it very, very difficult, to achieve this level of reasoning. But we are seeing progress. I mean, Colombia is one good example. In Colombia today, practically 25% of the Colombian territory has been legally recognized for indigenous peoples and Afro descendants. Through a long process of negotiation and of judicial structures to recognize land and territories. Now, unfortunately, indigenous peoples are not enjoying that, or their rights are not being fully exercised because of many problems having to do with illegal activities, drug trafficking, all those other things. So there's many things still to be solved, but at least I'm presenting this as an example that a government can take very proactive steps in order to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It was really insightful. So my question is based on the 5 operating principles that you mentioned. So in the case of BC, the provincial government has aligned its legislature with UNDRIP, to provide economic self-sufficiency and energy self-sufficiency for indigenous communities. And one of the solutions identified is to have indigenous communities as independent power producers who can supply electricity to the provincial grid, and the revenues that they generate from it would help them to maintain their indigenous power utilities. Instead of that, we have like the controversial Site C dam instead, where we. So I guess my question is, once we're done with the stages of identifying, analyzing, and engaging, and the efficient models of achieving these objectives of self-governance exist. But when it comes to the stage of partnering with indigenous communities, the response has been lukewarm by the governments. So in your experience, what do you think would be the barriers that are associated with this stage, and how can we overcome them?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very important question you're asking, and you're, very insightful. Yes, no, I can see exactly what you're describing. I think that I can perhaps mention two things regarding that. One is that the partnership with indigenous peoples, I think that it will continue to increase over time, but we have to live at the same time with the legacy issues. The new partnerships with indigenous peoples may be very well designed and may be very sustainable and may be very futuristic in the way that they are designed, but they have to coexist with legacy business or operations or institutional setups that may not allow it to thrive. So my advice there, or my reflection on that, is that indigenous peoples need to stay the course, need to be patient, and need to be persistent in maintaining their partnerships for that new vision, for that new world, while the legacy disappears, what we bring back from behind that may not be the ideal ways, we replace those eventually. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that in these partnerships, I think that and that's one of the concerns that I have, is that the revenues that indigenous peoples get through royalties or through other means when they partner with government or a private sector in a given country, how are those revenues being used? That's one of my worries, because I think that if those revenues, if that income is not used wisely in a community, in an indigenous people's nation, then we're defeating the purpose. We're not producing that staying power that we need, because we're not revitalizing our own community and our own people, our own nation. And that's why we at USAID, and also with the IPART program, we thought of this, what we call indigenous economies. What's that model of indigenous economies that will allow income to be generated and to come in, but to be used in a way that reinforces and strengthens the community values, the management or governance of our own territories and the rights of indigenous peoples, and not produce the same deviations and the same waste that we see in the outside world or in the dominant society happening. So to establish a model that is really sustainable for our communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about policy coherence across American foreign policy. Just to kind of draw a parallel that's not exactly the same, but made me think of this was in Canada, we have a feminist international assistance policy, but it's often criticized because there's little policy coherence between the feminist approaches taken to international assistance and then across trade and other foreign affairs policies. So I was just wondering if you could speak to whether there's efforts for policy coherence, for example, in recognizing Indigenous self-determination in trade or the doings of like American multinationals abroad. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'm not an expert in that area particularly, but what I can tell you is that I find a lot of coincidence and a lot of working together between different government agencies of the U.S. in its foreign policy. Just yesterday, we had a conversation with the Development Finance Corporation of the U.S. in discussing programs for Andean countries, and they're very much aligned with concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on how to prioritize excluded populations or marginalized populations, and so there's a lot of synergy with this policy. For instance, this USAID policy on promoting the rights of indigenous peoples. Personally, I'm part of a White House Council on Native American Affairs. I co-chair a subcommittee on Indigenous economic development together with a colleague from the Department of Interior. And one thing I have learned over the almost 1 year that we have been working on this is that there's a lot of coincidence, with today at least. I cannot speak about 10 years ago or even 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, or I cannot speak about 20 years ago, but I can speak about what I see today. And I see that there's a lot of efforts on the part of the federal agencies in the US to improve their attention and their programs for indigenous or tribal nations here in the US. And one thing that I see is that, increasingly they are abandoning the paternalistic approach that used to be the main dogma decades ago or for many years, which I find paternalism to be perhaps one of the worst forms of help for anybody, really, not only indigenous people, but in general. Paternalistic approaches are a vehicle for genocide, really. So I see that it's being abandoned through policies that are more empowering, that are enablers, that facilitate and that prioritize capacity development, education, respect, and empowering, so that the indigenous peoples can lead the way. I feel very happy, for instance, in our climate change strategy that was designed by USAID last year prior to the COP26 in Glasgow. We're able to include an intermediate result, which reads, partner with indigenous peoples and local communities to lead climate action. Those simple words, partner with indigenous peoples and local communities to lead climate action, are very powerful words. And they're not paternalistic, they're enabling, they're empowering, and that's what we need to do. And I think it's something which is not easy to do, you know, for a government or for a nonprofit organization, for a development agency. It's not easy to do. It's much easier to be paternalistic. It's much easier to just give out grants here and there, you know, give out money, give out royalties, just, you know, paychecks. It's much easier to get rid of the problem that way. But the consequences are really, really bad of doing it that way, because it's a paternalistic approach that stifles the willpower of people. So I really believe in methodologies and approaches that are different. And that's why I like this policy, the USAID policy that I presented today. If you analyze it, it's not a paternalistic policy. It's a policy very oriented to empowering indigenous peoples, to enable, and to try to address the restricting factors, such as government action, for instance, you know. So anyway, that's, and I know we have a long ways to go in the future, right? It's not easy, but to your question, of course, there may be still inconsistencies, you know, between the foreign policy and what this policy says, this USAID policy, but hopefully we'll be aligning that in the future.
We have just one last question, Luis Felipe.
This question is from Natasha, and the question is, when considering good public policy, how does one navigate the colonial inheritance of social, political, economic hierarchies that have become embedded in some indigenous communities? For example, the replacement of matriarchies or female positive cultures with patriarchies.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. To fight the legacy of colonialism is huge, right? It's monumental, and I have no easy answer for that. You know, but I do recognize the problem. Even today, with all the goodwill and the good intentions that there may be of governments and, you know, development agencies, etc., that still is present there. I think it has to be an effort that involves indigenous peoples themselves to recuperate, you know, their own history, their own culture, and to have the power to set their own vision for the future, you know. And development agencies, governments, all we can do is just help in that respect, be supportive of that process so that they can lead the way and do it in the best way possible.
Thank you so much, Luis Felipe, for your presentation, your wonderful insights, your recommendations, especially it's a good farewell to the end of the term. Thank you also to Rita Espadafora for guiding us into what IPAR is doing worldwide to empower indigenous peoples. And a good farewell also for from the School of Public Policy to all of you, and good luck in your new endeavors. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
It was an
Bye-bye.
honor to have you.